There's a difference between being lost on the trail and the trail claiming you forever. This story was sent to me by a solo hiker named Jennifer, who learned that some paths are walked not by the living, but by echoes of tragedy that are desperate for company. If you've ever found comfort in the kindness of a fellow hiker, this story will make you question every stranger you meet in the woods. Hit subscribe because the path ahead is dark and you won't want to walk it alone. This account comes from Jennifer. She was 3 days into her solo section hike on the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, and the climb up Blood Mountain was as brutal as the legends promised. The air was thick and humid, and the gnats were a constant, buzzing cloud around her head. It was in a rocky, exposed section near the summit that she first saw him. A man sitting on a boulder, calmly tightening the laces on his worn leather boots. He introduced himself as David. His gear was vintage, an external frame pack from a bygone era, a canteen instead of a hydration bladder. He had a quiet, anachronistic calm about him, a stillness that felt alien in the exhausting grind of the climb. He fell into step beside her, his pace unnervingly steady. He spoke of the trail with a fond, weary familiarity, but his references were odd. He mentioned shelters that had been dismantled years ago and talked about the new bypass at Girard Gap as if it had just been built. Jennifer, a modern hiker with a GPS and satellite messenger, rationalized it. He's just an old-school purist, she told herself, a little eccentric. This was the false calm, the mind clinging to logic in the face of growing unease. But here's where it gets really disturbing. They stopped for water at a stream crossing, and Jennifer's eyes caught a faded, laminated piece of paper wedged under a rock. It was a missing person flyer. The photo was grainy, black and white. The man in the picture, wanted for information regarding his 1978 disappearance, was David. The description matched him exactly, down to the distinctive chip in his front tooth. Her blood ran cold. She looked up. David was smiling at her from across the stream, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What they found next will haunt you." He pointed up a steep game trail riddled with bear scat. "This is a much better way. Cuts off 2 switchbacks. The views are incredible." His voice was persuasive, but everything in Jennifer's being screamed that it was wrong. The woods felt different there, silent, watchful. She remembered the trail register from the night before, filled with recent warnings about an aggressive bear and her cubs being spotted in this exact area. David seemed completely unconcerned. The truth was far worse than she imagined. In that moment, the pieces clicked into a horrifying picture. The outdated gear, the knowledge of a trail that no longer existed, the flyer. David wasn't just a ghost, he was a predator, using the memory of his own tragic death, a 1978 bear attack, to lure others to the same fate. He wasn't hiking alone. He was building a spectral party, leading the living off the path to become permanent members of his doomed eternal journey. Jennifer made an excuse, her voice trembling. She said she had to check her map. David's friendly demeanor faded, replaced by a flat, hollow look of profound disappointment. "No one ever wants to take the shortcut," he whispered, his voice suddenly sounding thin and far away. She turned and walked away, her back prickling. She didn't look back, forcing herself to stick to the well-marked, white-blazed trail. After what felt like an eternity, she dared a glance over her shoulder. The game trail was empty. David was gone. But standing at the tree line where the shortcut began, she saw them. Faint, shimmering figures of other hikers, their forms shifting in the dappled light. A man in 80s-style shorts, a woman with a gigantic pack from the 90s. Dozens of them, all watching her go, their faces etched with a silent, eternal longing. They were the ones who had taken the shortcut. Jennifer practically ran the last miles to the shelter. She reported what she saw to a ridge runner, but without proof. It was just another spooky trail story. She cut her hike short. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees behind her house, it sounds like a whisper. The views are incredible. It's an invitation she will spend the rest of her life refusing.
We all seek shelter from the storm, a place to rest our weary bones. But what if the shelter itself is the danger? This account comes from a thru-hiker named Marcus, who stumbled upon a remote Appalachian Trail shelter that offered more than just a roof. It offered a permanent residence. If you've ever been grateful for a warm meal on a cold night, this story will chill you to your core. Subscribe, because some hospitality comes with strings that can never be cut. This account comes from Marcus. He was 2 weeks into his northbound thru-hike, and the mountains of Tennessee had unleashed a relentless cold rain that soaked through his best gear and leached the warmth from his very bones. The trail had become a treacherous, muddy slip-and-slide, and the fog had descended so thickly that the world ended 10 feet in any direction. By the time the crude sign for Spence Field Shelter emerged from the gloom, he was operating on pure, shivering instinct. The promise of a dry platform and 4 walls felt like a divine intervention. The shelter was a classic 3-sided Adirondack shelter, but it was in a state of repair that was almost unnerving. The roof was sound, the wooden floorboards were swept clean, and a neat stack of perfectly split firewood was kept dry under a weathered tarp. And it was occupied. An elderly man, moving with a quiet, efficient grace, was on his knees, expertly blowing on the embers of a small fire in the stone hearth. He looked up as Marcus approached, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were a piercing, clear blue. He introduced himself as Elias. "The caretaker," he said, his voice a soft, raspy thing, like leaves skittering over stone. "The permanent one." Elias's knowledge of the trail was encyclopedic, breathtaking in its scope. He didn't just know that the upcoming river ford was high, he knew it was 6 inches higher than yesterday and which specific rocks were safest to cross on. He spoke of reroutes and trail magic from decades past as if they'd happened last week. To Marcus, drowning in the immediate misery of his soaked socks and aching muscles, Elias was a godsend. He accepted a cup of hot tea from the man's ancient, soot-blackened kettle, the warmth spreading through his hands like a blessing. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Elias gestured to a shelf where a thick, binder-style logbook sat, its cover faded by sun and speckled with mold. "The history of this place is in there," Elias said, a note of pride in his voice. "Read it. You'll see you're part of something much bigger than yourself." Marcus, eager to rest his feet, obliged. The entries were a fascinating timeline, stretching back to the 1960s, but the sheer volume of entries from the last few years, all written in the same meticulous, slightly ornate script, was odd. And then he saw the names. He froze, his blood running colder than the rain outside. Jake R., May 12th. He'd read about a Jake R. on a missing hiker forum. He vanished in the Smokies in 2001. The entry praised Elias's hearty stew. Another name, Lena G., missing since 1995, had written an entry dated just 2 months prior. His mind raced, building a flimsy raft of logic. Trail names get reused. It's a coincidence. This is just an old man's quirky hobby. It was a desperate, false calm, a rational mind trying to reject a truth that was slowly seeping into the shelter like the fog outside. As a deep, early darkness fell, Elias prepared a meal over the fire, a thick, savory stew in a cast-iron pot. The smell was intoxicating, a rich blend of herbs and a deep, gamey meat that made Marcus's stomach growl after days of bland, rehydrated food. "His special recipe," Elias said, handing him a brimming bowl. "Passed down. It helps a hiker put down roots." The phrase was strange, but Marcus, his hunger overwhelming his unease, ate it all. The meat was unlike any venison or beef he'd ever tasted, darker, richer, with a unique, almost iron-like tang. His eyes, now adjusted to the firelight, began to wander the shelter more carefully. That's when he saw the collection in the rafters. It wasn't just a few forgotten items. It was a systematic display. To the left, gear from the 60s and 70s, a canvas rucksack, a metal canteen, and a pair of worn leather boots. In the center, relics from the 80s and 90s, a broken external frame pack, a neon fanny pack, and a first-generation Gore-Tex jacket. And on the right, modern gear, a solar charger, a pair of trekking poles, and a bright blue rain jacket that Marcus was sure he'd seen in an outdoor magazine profile of a hiker who disappeared last season. They were organized not by use, but by decade, like trophies in a hunter's lodge.
What happened next will haunt you. Marcus woke up hours later, his gut twisting in violent, painful cramps. He scrambled from his sleeping bag, fumbling for his headlamp, and stumbled out into the cold night toward the privy path. He never made it. Doubled over in pain, he veered towards the woodpile, his headlamp beam swinging wildly. The light caught something unnatural. A flash of modern, brightly colored nylon fabric, not buried, but carefully tucked under the bottom layer of logs, as if to weigh it down. Gasping, he pulled at it. It was a backpack, a recent model. As he yanked it free, a cascade of loose, dark soil fell away, revealing more. Another pack beneath it, and another. He began to dig with his bare hands, a horrifying, frantic energy driving him. He uncovered a whole strata of backpacks, water bottles, stuffed socks, and sleeping pads, all buried in a neat, deep pit. It was a gear cemetery. The truth was far worse than he imagined. The cramping wasn't from bad water. It was a reaction. The special recipe wasn't just stew. This shelter wasn't a refuge. It was a farm. And Elias was the farmer, cultivating his own unique crop. The hikers he cared for were his livestock and his companions. He consumed them body and soul, using his energy to sustain his own unnatural longevity. And he preserved their belongings as mementos of his eternal solitary vigil. The logbook was his fantasy, a story he wrote to convince himself they never left, that he wasn't alone. Marcus didn't go back for his gear. He left it all. His pack, his food, his sleeping bag. He ran. He crashed through the wet undergrowth in a blind panic, branches whipping his face, the cold air searing his lungs. He didn't follow the trail, he followed the downward slope, stumbling and falling, until he finally burst out onto a gravel forestry road, just as the sun was blearily breaking through the clouds. He found a ranger later that day, babbling his story. They humored him, took him back to the shelter. It was empty. The fire was dead and cold. The logbook was gone. The gear in the rafters was gone. The ground under the woodpile was packed solid, untouched. They told him it was exposure, dehydration, maybe even carbon monoxide poisoning from the fire. They told him he was lucky to be alive. Marcus never finished his hike. He can't. He lives in a city now, as far from the woods as he can get. But the memory is preserved, as pristine as Elias's trophies. He can't eat any kind of stew. He can't walk into a gear shop without his heart seizing up.
And on quiet, rainy nights, he can still hear the soft, raspy whisper like leaves on stone, saying, "It helps you put down roots." It was never an invitation. It was a warning.
We've all heard of trail angels, those kind souls who appear when a hiker is at their lowest, offering a cold drink, a ride to town, a moment of grace. This account comes from a hiker named Sarah, who learned that some angels have fallen, and their mercy is a cage. If you've ever accepted a helping hand from a stranger, this story will make you question the price of that kindness. Subscribe, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This account comes from Sarah. She was deep in the roller coaster hills of Shenandoah National Park, her body pushed beyond its limits. A persistent grinding pain in her knee had turned every downhill step into a knife-sharp jab, and her spirit was frayed raw. She was sitting on a log by the roadside, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion, when a beat-up, wood-paneled station wagon, a relic from the '80s, pulled over. The woman who leaned across the passenger seat had a face as warm and crinkled as a baked apple. "You look like you could use some real trail magic, honey," she said. Her name was Mabel. Mabel was everything a broken hiker dreamed of. She had a cooler in the back seat filled with cold sodas, fresh fruit, and homemade cookies. She clucked sympathetically about Sarah's knee. "You can't fix that out here," she said. "I've got a little cabin just down the road. You can rest up, have a hot shower, and get back at it tomorrow good as new." It felt like a miracle. The false calm of salvation washed over Sarah, drowning out the tiny, nagging voice that told her not to get in a car with a stranger. The cabin was indeed just down the road, but it was also a world away, tucked down a long, unmarked gravel drive surrounded by a thick, silent forest. It was cozy in a cluttered, old-fashioned way, with doilies on the arms of floral print chairs. Mabel fussed over her, insisting she take a hot shower while she prepared a proper recovery meal. As Sarah dried off with a towel that smelled faintly of mothballs, her eyes wandered to a bookshelf. It wasn't filled with books. It was lined with rows of wallets, smartphones, and worn trail guides. One of them, a distinctive bright yellow waterproof case, looked exactly like the one her friend Chloe had on her thru-hike attempt last year. Chloe, who had vanished in the Shenandoahs without a trace. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Trying to shake off a growing sense of dread, Sarah limped into the hallway. A door slightly ajar revealed a set of stairs leading down to a basement. The smell that wafted up was familiar, the unmistakable funky scent of a hiker hostel, sweat, dirt, and synthetic fabric. Driven by a chilling curiosity, she crept down. The basement was long and low-ceilinged, and it was not a storage space. It was a dormitory. Dozens of sleeping bags and pads were laid out on the concrete floor, and in them were people. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, methodically, packing and unpacking their backpacks in a silent, endless loop. One man was meticulously applying duct tape to a pair of boots that were already more tape than leather. They were all hikers, from different eras, their gear a timeline of outdoor trends from the last 30 years. They were still here. They had never left. What Sarah discovered next will haunt you. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a man in the corner who was staring blankly at a map. His face was on a missing poster she'd seen at the last outfitter, James Allen Catley, who disappeared in 2022. He wasn't dead. He was just stored. That's when she understood. Mabel wasn't just providing shelter. She was saving them. In her twisted mind, she was protecting them from the dangers of the trail, the injuries, the weather, the loneliness, by making them permanent guests in her secluded sanctuary. She was the ultimate trail angel, offering a salvation that was in fact a life sentence. The truth was far worse than she imagined. Sarah turned to flee, but Mabel was standing at the foot of the stairs, blocking her exit. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her kind eyes held a terrifying, possessive certainty. "You see," Mabel said softly, gesturing to the silent hikers, "they're safe here. They don't have to suffer anymore. And neither do you, my dear. Your hike is over. You're home." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't being offered hospitality, she was being inducted. This cabin was a collection, and Mabel saw her as the newest, most precious addition. In a burst of adrenaline that overrode the pain in her knee, Sarah didn't plead or reason. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the basement's eerie quiet. The spell of passive misery seemed to break for a moment. The hikers looked up, startled. In that split second of Mabel's shocked hesitation, Sarah shoved past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. She burst out of the cabin and ran, ignoring the searing pain in her leg, fueled by pure terror. She didn't stop until she reached the parkway, flagging down a family in a minivan who took her straight to the rangers. She told them everything. When they went to the location, they found nothing. No cabin, no gravel drive, just dense, undisturbed forest. There was no record of Mabel anywhere in the area. Sarah left the trail for good. The physical pain in her knee faded, but the psychological scar remains. She can't accept help from anyone anymore. And sometimes when she's in a crowded store or a busy street, she'll see a woman with kind, crinkly eyes from a distance, and her blood runs cold. Because she knows that for some, the trail doesn't end at Katahdin or Springer. It ends in a basement, forever unpacking your bag, safe and sound, and utterly, eternally lost.
For every through hiker, Mount Katahdin is more than a mountain. It's a promise, a finish line, a sacred end to a 2,200-mile pilgrimage. This account comes from a section hiker named Tom, who reached that summit only to discover that, for some, the end is just the beginning of an eternal, frozen nightmare. If you've ever pushed yourself to reach a goal, this story will make you wonder what happens if you push just a little too far. Subscribe, because some journeys don't have an exit. This account comes from Tom. He was tackling the final stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Baxter State Park, the air already carrying the sharp, foreboding chill of an early autumn in Maine. The forecast was volatile, but his window to summit Katahdin was closing. As he made his final camp at the base of the mountain, he met another hiker, a man named Alex, who was preparing for a pre-dawn ascent. Alex had a feverish, single-minded intensity that Tom admired. His gear, however, was a chaotic museum piece. He wore worn leather boots that looked decades old, carried a vintage external frame pack, but also had a modern water filter and a headlamp. It was an odd mix, but Tom wrote it off as the eccentricity of a seasoned thru-hiker. They began their climb together in the dark, their headlamps cutting narrow cones of light into the oppressive blackness. Alex set a punishing pace, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his movements sure and relentless. As they ascended above the tree line, the weather turned. A wicked wind whipped across the granite boulders, and a freezing mist began to coat everything in a slick, invisible layer of ice. Tom, feeling the dangerous cold seeping into his bones, suggested they turn back. Alex just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the summit, barely visible through the scudding clouds. "I'm so close," he whispered, his voice raw. I just need to finish. One more time. Then I can rest. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Tom noticed that Alex wasn't shivering. His lips weren't blue. The freezing rain seemed to bead up and roll off his outdated jacket, while Tom's modern, expensive shell was becoming saturated and cold. As they navigated a treacherous section called the Knife Edge, a narrow spine of rock with 1,000-foot drops on either side, Alex pointed out landmarks and recounted stories of hikers who had fallen. That was in '67, he'd say, or she slipped right there in '92. He spoke with an intimate, first-hand knowledge that was impossible. He knew the names, the dates, the exact circumstances of all 64 documented fatalities on the mountain since 1933. Tom, clinging to the rock, his fingers going numb, tried to rationalize it. Alex is a history buff. He's memorized the park records. This was the false calm, a mind desperately trying to ignore the supernatural evidence forming right before his eyes. What happened next will haunt you. The wind howled, threatening to pluck them from the rock. Tom knew, with a chilling certainty, that to go further was to die. He yelled at Alex over the gale, "We have to go back! This is suicide!" Alex finally stopped and turned to look at him. In the bleak, gray light, his face was a mask of an ancient, profound exhaustion that no living man could possess. "I can't go back," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a bottomless despair. "I can never go back. I have to make the summit." Then he looked at Tom, and his eyes were no longer focused on the trail ahead, but on Tom himself, with a desperate, calculating hunger. But maybe if someone else finished for me. The truth was far worse than he imagined. Alex wasn't a thru hiker trying to complete his journey. He was a ghost, a soul who had died on this mountain decades ago during a similar storm. He was trapped in an endless purgatorial loop, condemned to repeat his final, fatal summit attempt for all eternity. And his only hope of release was to find a replacement, to lure another hiker to take his place in this frozen damnation, to complete the climb he never could. Tom didn't wait for another word. He turned and began a frantic, dangerous retreat, scrambling back across the knife edge, his heart in his throat. He glanced back once. Alex wasn't following. He was just standing there, a solitary figure being swallowed by the mist, already turning back toward the summit to begin his futile climb once more. Tom made it down, reporting the distressed hiker to the rangers. A search party found no one. When Tom described Alex, one of the older rangers grew pale and showed him a photo from a 1975 incident report. It was Alex. He had died of exposure on the summit plateau during a sudden Labor Day blizzard. Tom never set foot on Katahdin again. He got his summit photo from a safe distance, but the experience left him with a permanent chill. He can't stand the sound of wind whistling through a narrow space. And every year, when the autumn weather turns, he checks the Baxter State Park news. And every year, there's a report. A hiker, sometimes alone, sometimes with a group, who pushed too hard, ignored the warnings, and had to be rescued, or worse, on the summit ridge. And Tom can't help but wonder if they met a man named Alex, a man with old boots and a new headlamp, who offered to show them the way up, desperate to finally show someone the way out.